morning and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the second webinar brought to you by the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba. My name is Karen Wallace-Chuck and I will be your host for today. In just a few minutes, we'll jump into today's conversation on the revolutionary world of generative AI, focusing on the transformative potential of ChatGPT. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojai Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. One quick note about your ability to participate in today's webinar. Please submit questions using the Q&A function. We'll monitor it closely and incorporate your questions in the discussion as best we can and as time permits. I'd now like to introduce our panel for today. Our first panel member is Rod Lastra, Acting Dean of the Division of Extended Education here at the University of Manitoba. Rod is an experienced expert in adult and lifelong education with over 25 years experience in higher education. He holds a master's and PhD in science, and his research background is in theoretical ecology, brings a unique multidisciplinary approach to his work. Rod has a keen interest in understanding the intersectionality of emerging technologies such as AI on lifelong education models and learning methodologies. As current president of the Canadian Association of University Continuing Education, Rod is involved in collaborative projects that help shape lifelong learning policies and blends research with technology to create an inclusive learning ecosystem. Next, I'd like to introduce Ray Schroeder, Distinguished Educator and Senior Fellow at UPCEA, the Online and Professional Education Association, and Professor Emeritus at University of Illinois Springfield. Ray is a nationally respected and connected leader in higher education and online learning. He's a noted speaker, consultant, researcher, and author on topics related to online learning, emerging educational technologies, and technology-enhanced learning. He's received numerous national awards and citations for individual excellence and leadership from many associations and entities, including the Online Learning Consortium, the U.S. Distance Learning Association, the American Journal of Distance Education, the University of Wisconsin, and the University of Illinois. Most recently, Ray received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from the University of Illinois Springfield. And now I'll pass it over to Rod to start today's discussion.
Thank you, Karen. Before we start, I assume everyone can see the slide in front of them. Okay. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, we're going to be trying to unpack our basic understanding of the potential use of ChatGPT. And I'm going to provide a little bit of a background. And I have to say a little bit of a disclosure before we start. Things in this field have evolved very rapidly. In fact, so rapidly, I had this presentation finished last Friday, and I had to redo it again a couple of days ago with what happened on Monday. So just to give you an idea of how quickly things are evolving. So ChatGPT came to our attention in November 2022, some updates with ChatGPT 4 in March 2023, and then late fall, there's been voice and vision inclusion. DALL-E has been included, and also there is a ChatGPT Enterprise that is out there. I should add, by the way, as a bit of a plug, the image on the left-hand side was generated by ChatGPT by me asking it to generate a generative AI logo that I can use on this presentation. So there's been a great deal of development. On Monday, however, on November 7th, it was the OpenAI Developers Day, where they announced a number of exciting things, including updates to ChatGPT 4 Turbo, browsing the web, auto model picker. But for developers, which I thought was less critical for users, was the copyright shield statement that OpenAI is saying. Basically, if someone is sued for using OpenAI content, that OpenAI will actually help out the user in this case. really interesting was the concept of the GPTs. In other words, the customized like GPT agents and the GPT store in which you can create your own GPT, which made me think. So last night I was playing around with this and I noticed that in my full version of ChatGPT that I have, at the very top, there is a thing called Create GPT. And if you go into it, you can actually get into the developer's environment. But here's the important note. Without the necessity for coding, you can do this using natural language. So I played around with it, and here's what I came up with. So there's ways that you can configure this and actually customize your GTP tool. So here's what I did. I actually said, okay, I'm going to try something and see if it works. In our division, we develop programs. And so I actually gave it our template for program proposals for micro-credentials and certificate programs. And then on top of that, I embedded all of the University of Manitoba's regulations when it comes to programs. And here's what I came up with. Now, this is just kind of my own version test run on my GTP automator. It's called the Alternative Credential Template Automator. Guides in filling and customizing university program proposals. And when I ran this through, it actually works quite nicely. Not as an end product, but as a way from ideation to concept, from point form to concept. So again, not a final product, but an enormous time saver, enormous potential. So this, in a matter of like 3 hours that I was playing around with this last night, has really, in my humble view, changed everything when it comes to our interaction with GPT. Now, a little bit of a word about how it works, and I'm just going to spend a few moments before we launch into a discussion with Ray. There are many references out there. For those of you who are interested in digging deep, I would say go to Stephen Wolfram's book, What is ChatGPT Doing and Why Does It Work? Great publication, and it's actually online, so you can actually get it online as well. So how does it work? Well, GPT is actually a large language model based on machine learning, based on kind of the complexity of neural networks. And we talked about this last month when we met with Kelly. So what it does is that if you're using text, it becomes a large language model to generate output. If you're using vast amounts of text, it's a generative pre-trained transformer model. If you're using multiple sources of information, not just text, images, sound, video, and text, it becomes a foundation model. Please note this. One of the things that happened over the course of this past month is that GPT went from being a generative pre-trained transformer model to a foundations model. It's able to do a lot of things beyond just text to generation of content. So how does it work? Well, the model is broken down into two areas, the developer API and the user interface. So let's talk a little bit about the developer API. If you notice the big bold lettering there, it's all to do with data inputs. In April, we'll talk about the implications of this when we have a conversation with our other speaker, and we'll dig deep into what this means. But for now, data training is big in the API developer front. And then this is where you customize the specific aspects of your model. You set the temperature. The temperature really is a way to set how randomizable the program is going to be in terms of how it predicts content, right? That is all set at the developer stage, right? And so you train it, you choose the data, and then what you end up with at the end is a user interface, which is really a bit of a fixed program. But there is magic in this fixed program, and I'll explain how this works. There are a number of processes involved. There's a pre-process, there's a pre-train. Pre-train means it's already trained, transformer, neural network, and there's the post-process aspect of this. We'll begin with the first step, right? Before we get it into the neural net, we'll start with the prompt, right? So when prompting, the first thing to recognize is that prompting is an expository exercise. It's not just one word like a Google search. It's really an expository exercise. So there are basically three ways that we can prompt. There's what I call open prompting, which is the least interesting. It's the what is question. What is a car? What is an airplane? What is a computer, right? So you're asking it to really extract sources of its data. And it does an okay job there. Open prompting with extractive questions is that you can dig deep. You can say, what is a computer? It'll give you a response. Can you define for me the difference between a regular computer and a quantum computer? And then it'll dig a little bit deeper. And then that extractive question answer thing will actually give you a little bit more information. The one I like is the closed prompting approach. Closed prompting means you provide it with something. You provide it with text. You provide it with information, and you ask it to review it. You ask it to improve it, and then you follow up with a bunch of questions. There is like enormous, potential in that area. So here's a quick example. Open prompt, very simple question. What is a black hole, right? Now, remember, we're talking to a computer. Here's an important thing to remember. Although we call this artificial intelligence, it has no clue what you're typing, right? Computers don't read text per se. So when I say what is a black hole, there is a bit of magic happens here in terms of being able to convert this to a computer language. So the first thing that happens is that the system will actually take that word or that phrase and break it down into tokens. And the tokens are what is a black hole, right? And then it will convert those into what it's comfortable with as a computer, integers. So each of those words are converted to integers. And then here's where the other thing happens called embedding. And this is a really important step in GPT, is that it converts each of those word integers into an array of numbers. And these array of numbers are coordinates. Now, what does this do? Very simply, it provides the word, and get this, with identity, meaning, and relationships based on the trained data. Again, I'll say that again, identity, meaning, and relationships of words. So in the trained model, which is really what a large language model does, here's what it looks like. So the trained data has this corpus library of information, and it's able to say, for example, committee and member and organization and movement are all clustered terms, right? And the same thing with economy, growth rates, and cost and sales, those are clustered terms. And so it'll take the array of your statement, and it'll try to map it out based on what it knows. It'll also try to map it out based on the parts of speech. So in other words, based on things such as noun, verb, adjective, right? So it tries to get meaning, tries to get context, right? And this is really what is called linguistic feature space, where it's actually doing really sophisticated linguistic analysis of what you are trying to do. And then once you do this, you put it into the actual neural nets. That's when it understands, it conceptualizes. When I said black hole, it now referenced, I think I know what you're talking about. I think I know what a black hole is. And it can, conceptualize it as a concept, not as an individual word definition, black and hole, right? The concept black hole, which is an astrophysical concept, now it can do that. Last thing it does is that it goes into a statistical probability mode, in which it responds based on its data, what it feels is the best response possible, right? And this is where errors can occur, and we'll talk about that later. And then what you get at the end is the content generation. A black hole is a region in space where gravity is so strong that nothing, not even light, can escape from it. Pretty trivial answer, but you can do much more sophisticated approaches. So that's basically the functioning of a GPT model. Now, the conversation for today, and the reason why I like to kind of dig into the utility of this with Ray is, Ray has been working in ed tech technologies for quite some time. I put a reference in the webinar space. Those of you who are signed on can actually see this. Ray has put together a blog basically of an enormous volume library of resources to look into everything from governance to utility to practice. I would strongly encourage people who are signed up to look at this. How I got to know Ray, by the way, was he's a member of UPCEA. I took a course with him last spring on this entire area of generative AI for continuing education professionals. And I really, really enjoyed his course. And it was the impetus to invite him for this conversation. So Ray, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you here today. And what I would like to begin with is asking you kind of a fundamental question, understanding all of this is happening with respect to the space and really kind of leaning on your expertise. Can you talk about the intersectionality of technology and education? And what I would like you to do is really reflect based on your experiences on those pivotal moments when technology had profound transformative impacts on education, where it actually did and where expectation exceeded reality, right?
Well, first of all, thank you, Rod. And I am honored to be here to speak to this large group, and thanks so much for inviting me. Um, I started teaching on the faculty of the Urbana campus in 1971 and taught through the decades and ultimately retired almost 2 years ago, I guess it was, from the University of Illinois system and the Springfield campus at that point in particular. But now to your question, technology is always, almost, from the very beginning, whether it's a stylus on a tablet or drawing lines in the sand, it's been engaged in the process and used in education. Um, in back in 71, I used something called Plato, and a few of those out in the audience will have heard of Plato, a CDC-based system, Control Data Corporation, that linked together computers, as it turns out, on 6 continents at least, and at mostly at colleges and universities. And that really became kind of a prototype or a forerunner for those things we enjoy now on the internet. But in 67, just before that, came hand calculators, and a big concern. Now people will no longer be able to add, subtract, divide, and do a square root. Um, well, those concerns went away, and yet in another respect, they were correct, because there's almost no place in this world now that you don't have access to some sort of portable or fixed calculation system. The programmable calculator came out in 74. Once again, you had to drop your programmable calculator at the front of the classroom when you took a quiz, because you could have programmed material in. But of course, in 69, we had ARPANET, and that's the forerunner of the internet. And in 83, it transitioned to TCP/IP. That was probably the most important step in the development of the internet. And I mention that because back in that day, we used to move around the internet using Unix commands. So you would FTP a file or telnet to get access to images. But that became refined. Fortunately, I must say, the University of Illinois in 1992 developed Mosaic, Mark Andreessen, which became the prototype for Navigator and all the later browsers. So technology moved forward, and and really allowed accessibility. I would say is probably the most important aspect of technology. Fluidity in the sense that we could more quickly accomplish the end without having structures get in the way of solving problems and getting solutions. But it didn't always work. And Rod, you're absolutely right. There was this thing called Google Wave, and maybe fewer people will have heard of it, but it was in 1970. Oh, no, it was actually in 2000, about 2009, that Google developed a whole host of applications that were Java based. And they were really useful little tools that you could put together and use. And I had co-authored with a friend at the University of Sligo Technological Institute in Ireland, and we had published. And I, in fact, was live at a national conference on the day that Google announced it was ending Google Wave. So about 100,000 people used it. That wasn't enough. And so while it still, I believe, would have been a useful tool back then, it was turned off. And So yes, technology moves forward in fits and starts. And I think one more quick piece that probably will come up again is that we're not even a year old. That is ChatGPT. It was November 30th, I think, of last year
Mhm.
that it was released. And so, a lot has been accomplished in a year and some mistakes along the way, and there will be more, but so much has been accomplished in this short time. So, as we move forward now in our discussions, Rod, I think we need to keep that in mind.
Thanks, Ray. So let's talk a little bit about utility, and I'm going to show a bit of a graph here that really looks at, this is kind of a compilation of papers and opinions out there with respect to the trustworthiness of the output. And there is a distinction in terms of trustworthiness of output. If you notice the deep purple, or the purple that appears on screen, is low trustworthiness, blue is medium, yellow is high. And when it comes to academic or scientific writing, for example, just one example, text authored content by ChatGPT, the trustworthiness is fairly low. When it comes to things such as improving prose, improving and reviewing materials for academic stuff, it's actually fairly high. When it comes to creative works, that's where it gets a little bit more interesting, because in the creative works, even the text authored, generative AI is actually doing a decent enough job, which, by the way, for those who have been following, was one of the main touch points of the Hollywood writer's strike recently, was the fact that on the creative end, these tools can really create some issues. And there are really some union implications for this. So let's talk a little bit about, again, explore some of the potential uses, some of the concerns with the implementation of generative AI, and specifically, Ray, your perspectives on learners and educators.
Sure. Well, I think that there is skepticism among many. And in fact, there's a whole social consideration going on in education. And we saw this back in the early 2000s, late 1990s, when we moved toward online learning in the first case. There were many faculty members who said, no, unless I can see them, see their eyes and interact with the students, I just can't teach. And it'll never be effective when we're not fully face to face. And yet, over time, that is overcome. Now, I think that there are questions and concerns that faculty members have about this technology. And yet, when we get down to the very heart of it, many of the faculty members are intimidated by the technology. They incompletely understand it. They know that, and they're afraid to use this technology. So there's an inherent fear in using these technologies. We found, I had sent out a report. I have several curated reading lists, and twice as many students, that is about 80%, and less actually use and report that they have used generative AI. And yet closer to 30% of faculty have reported that they have used generative AI. And so we see many more students jumping into it. They don't have that fear. They have, kind of an excitement and are ready to try out the technology. Faculty members have reservations. And I think that's really at the source of much of this. Bill Gates, of course, and Sebastian Thrun both said this is the biggest development in our lifetimes. The biggest development in our lifetimes, generative AI. So far, it's far more. And for Gates to say that, it's more important than the microcomputer, than the computer, than all the Microsoft programs. It is, in fact, that huge, huge piece. I see the potential for us to access learners who have disabilities, those at a distance, those who have other time commitments. There are so many ways that we can use this. And, Mark Zuckerberg, in his own way, quietly has been continuously developing this metaverse, in which intelligent chat GPT, or if you will, generative AI avatars will live and will respond to you just as humans do. So the potential is enormous. It will have a huge effect. It will be as big an effect as the internet, I'll say. So I'll pause right there.
So that's really interesting, Ray. So from your perspective, what impacts do you feel that this could have on kind of our natural pedagogy models that we have, andragogy models, in terms of what we're doing in higher education? I mean, if you were to look forward in the next couple of years, where do you foresee kind of some impacts that we might be facing and some things that we may need to be prepared to respond to?
Well, certainly I see it's just-in-time learning. This is a way that we can, just as you develop that form in 3 hours, and it had to be refined, and everything we do with it at this point certainly has to be refined, but we can respond so much faster than we ever could in developing curricula, courses, customized learning for the individual student. We talk a lot about personalized learning, and that's really kind of the icon that we're looking for, is to be able to customize, not having to do a bell curve and teach 30 students, but have 30 classes teaching students. And that's something that we do have the potential to do using this technology. So, I'll digress for just a moment to talk about something that I've been noodling about called synthetic students. Now, up till now, I have not taught more than one or two, maybe, self-paced learning classes, because the whole concept, if we look at continuing ed, is that if we have an audience out there that is working, that has all kinds of obligations, some of them can move very quickly, can do an intensive month on a class and be done. Others, it'll take 18 weeks or, maybe even a year. And the problem that we've always had with these self-paced courses is we couldn't create the interaction that we see in discussion boards, the peer-to-peer, the group projects. And yet now, soon, perhaps next semester, we will see classes, cohorts of virtual or synthetic students who will be able to participate in the discussion board, so that previously a student, we open the discussion board every week and we talk about what's going on, and the students challenge one another. But using this technology, we can identify, or we can ask generative AI to speak in the voice of a student from, name it, from the Ukraine, from somewhere in rural or urban or older student or younger student, so that you can create a whole host of these voices. Then, given the readings that you've done in the class, that they can respond to the discussion question and engage the student, the live student, where they are, when they are. And so this is a huge step forward for us in education, I think.
No, and that's a really interesting idea, Ray. I mean, when you said earlier about the in the first question, your response about the emergence of technologies, it made me think, one of the things that has happened at every turn, whether it was a calculator or whether it was the implementation of software. I remember, in the 80s and 90s, powerful software tools that you could use to do analysis. One of the critiques is that back in the day, you would do a lot of that number crunching by hand. which was the reason why in research there were some limitations in terms of the kind of analysis that you can do based on what you can perform on paper. The ability to have these powerful tools, enter data, hit a button, and have an output means that you can have garbage in, garbage out, right? Even with really good algorithms. So even back in the 80s, the idea was, let's train our learners to not only know the complexities of what they need to do, but to be critical thinkers, to assess, and not to just receive information, but to be critical thinkers. To that extent, I mean, and I think you're hinting at it, to what extent do we need to think about that, about embedding the aspect of being a resilient, critical thinker within a higher education, framework?
Yeah, those values remain. And, I recall the dean at the U.S. Military Academy, let's see, who recently posted that, let's not forget that we need to instill philosophy and other gen ed type skills that we develop in those classes of critical thinking and creative thinking. We need to continue to do that. This gives us an opportunity to do it, but once again, to follow up on an individual student so that if in responses a student does not exemplify a depth of critical thinking, this can automatically jump in. I recall teaching 30 students in a class, and let's just take that as a norm. It is so hard, even if you're only teaching 3 classes a semester, it's so hard to take those 90 students and work with them individually and schedule appointments and follow up and provide the kind of tutoring such as, we hear from Khan Academy, the Conmigo, which is a tool, which is a ChatGPT based tool that's been developed there to respond and to tutor those students by identifying areas where they have a deficit or they've not fully fulfilled the expectation for whatever you will, but for critical thinking, creative thinking, for fully understanding the subject at hand. So the waterfront is very broad for us in this field. And we can find ways to address those challenges using this tool. And it's a tool, but using this tool, we can reach out and let it identify shortcomings, inform the instructor, and you can watch the progress.
Thanks, Ray. Before I get to my next question, just a quick commentary for our listeners out there. I will be uploading the presentation after this event. So if you'd like to kind of peruse through the slides and look at the text, I know that some of the wording may be a little small, that will be uploaded to the site afterwards. All right, so let's kind of extend this a little bit more then to kind of the institutional level and what institutions are doing in this respect to kind of provide some oversight and guidance. And I do know there's been some really important movements on this front. One of them being Western University has been one of the first universities in the US and Canada to really appoint a chief AI officer, Mark Daly, who will begin to look into the regulatory frameworks that the universities are creating and to perhaps have a critical perspective in terms of where we need to be. So maybe everything from pedagogy, andragogy, to the basic policies, the IP, all of those things that are going to be important for our faculty, for our staff, and our students to be able to consider. Ray, can you comment a little bit about this?
Yes, I think this is a huge step. And I would add pedagogy as well, because this is a way in which the Chat GPT or Gen AI broadly can become that guide assisting the student in developing research for whatever topic they choose. But that development at Western and Mark Daly is just huge. I posted this morning, we had a posting from UT San Antonio, University of Texas, San Antonio as they're looking at developing an institution-wide policy on AI and how it's going to impact all aspects of the institution. And I quickly responded with the name and the article that you have up there with Mark Daly. That's really a model that we will, I think, need to follow. It's going to be so important. And it's so important not only for the potential as an educational instrument, but in business, industry, government, broadly outside the university, this technology is so very important. You know, um, the trinity, if you will, of these research institutions, that being Harvard, MIT, and UPenn Wharton, did a study, a tracking study beginning in January of this year, and it ran until September, maybe is still going on. But the first report was given, and that was they were tracking the use of generative AI at the Boston Consulting Group, which is a very high level, pardon me, expensive consulting group based in Boston with some of the best graduates from the best universities around the country serving as consultants. A large firm. They followed 800 some of the consultants, not all of them, but 800. And they found an increase in productivity of 40% among those consultants. And they found an increase was actually higher among those who were lower performing. And also the quality seemed to improve. So all of this continuing study, more data to come out, that was released in September. It's, there's very little hard studies on the use of this technology, again, because we're not even a year old, because it's only been out there in an identifiable form for that long. But that's huge. And what does that mean? Well, that means that employers already, HR departments are requiring or asking of applicants that they provide a portfolio of prompts and other evidence of what they've done with this technology, whether it be ChatGPT or any of the other apps that are available. So we need to respond. It's irresponsible if universities don't find a way to work with our students to help them identify and to understand, just like your opening lecturette on how the technology works. We need to have our graduates understand, be able to utilize and demonstrate, those who graduate in January, those who graduate in May. And the problem is that too many of us, too many institutions only visit their curriculum every 4 or 5 years. Well, this can't wait for that. This is a revolution that is rapid paced, it's taking place quickly, and we need to respond now in higher ed, not only to utilize it as a tool, but also to include among our learning outcomes pieces of learning for our students as they move forward.
Thanks, Ray. And I'm wondering what you think too. I mean, Christopher Potts, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Linguistics, and courtesy, a professor in the Department of Computer Science at Stanford, recently said that when it comes to generative AI regulations, he would prefer that those regulations not be at the institutional level, that they have to be almost at the department level, because the implications of this technology will vary by discipline and the incursions of everything, the potential and the concerns, and having an oversweeping policy may not work. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. And among those articles, I have 20 some on the topic that were in Inside Higher Ed. I suggest we start at the department level. And the department needs to identify where we are now, and that requires them to reach out to their partners in employers, among employers, and identify what the needs are. But this is changing very rapidly, so we can't just do it, in January and be done. Now we're going to have to do it a couple times a year, continuing to track where we are with the needs. And you're absolutely right. Art has, for example, artistic areas have one set of considerations. MBAs have another. Accounting has a huge challenge because the prediction is, and we've already seen, a drop in the hiring of accountants. So how can accountants adapt their careers and their expertise in order to survive AI taking over many of the tasks that had previously required a baccalaureate or a CPA? So, each department needs to look at this and look at where their students potentially are placed and talk to the industry. I hope more and more often this is going to be pulling together our employers, industry, business with the educational community.
Thanks, Ray. And I think this really gets to another interesting point that I'd like to explore a little bit, and that's kind of the use case, going back to the learner, right? And before we get into that, before I ask you to kind of reflect on this, I'd like to share kind of a little trial run, a little experiment I did myself, utilizing ChatGPT as a potential tutor. So just for context, so my background is in ecology. In my PhD, I focused a lot on some theoretical ideas. One of them was this idea of neutral theory in ecology, right? And how it relates to species diversity. So I asked it to provide me with kind of a basic understanding of what neutral theory was all about. So I prompted it and I got a response, right? And I looked over it quickly, and interconnectedness and species equivalencies and random. So at first blush, yes, seems to be doing a good job, right? So then I said, okay, could you provide a little bit more in-depth explanation on Hubble's neutral theory, right? And it did just that. It provided a brief bio on Stephen Hubble in 2001 in his book that he released, the mathematical frameworks. I prompted it to actually explain the mathematics, and it did an excellent job explaining that. I asked it to maybe graph, the outputs, kind of the theoretical outputs. I activated the Wolfram plugin in ChatGPT. It tried to do it, and interestingly, look at this. It had an error with the 3D plot. So it says, sorry, I can't do the 3D plot, but I'll do the 2D plot, and it did it. And actually, it did it correctly. So I was like, oh, wonderful. And then I was going back and looking at my initial prompt, and I realized one problem. I didn't type in neutral theory in my first prompt. I typed in neural theory by accident. And I thought, oh, but how did it give me the answer correctly? Again, going back to that probabilistic association. And I read the response again and noticed there was a problem. It said neural theory in ecology is an analogy that compares ecosystems to neural networks in the brain. And just like neurons in the brain, species and ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. Rubbish. Completely wrong. The rest of it underneath was correct, but then I noticed, wait a second, learning and adaptation, nothing to do with what I asked it to prompt me. So the lesson learned here is, when it comes to using these things as learning assistants, I strongly believe that there has to be an expert interface. And simply using these at this day and age blindly, it's like entering data into a computer software package, garbage in, garbage out. If you're not careful, and if you don't know, it could be misleading. And I know you commented on this idea already, Ray, but maybe if we can explore this a little bit more.
Well, absolutely. I think that a depth of understanding is required, and precision, certainly in prompt writing and crafting, is essential. the whole garbage in, garbage out, concept that we had in computer science, I think applies. Now, I want to talk about question 4, okay? Yes? Yeah,
Yep.
okay. So when we take a look at some predictions from Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, he's predicted that that is his company, will release before the end of the year an OpenAI Academy. And he describes it as a free, accessible to higher ed and all of education, that site that will provide bots that can serve as instructors. You upload the basic information, and these will become the instructors. And notably, almost nearly a year ago, it was that Altman contracted with Khan Academy to create a tutor called Conmigo, as it turns out, for an undisclosed amount of money, most likely in the tens of millions, maybe a little more than that, of dollars. And that being a key piece of this kind of generative AI instruction mechanical device, but it's more than mechanical, intuitive in a sense, as we look at the way in which it intuits from that broad compilation of information. So I still expect in December to hear from OpenAI about the Academy. And if we don't, I know that there are other companies already poised to provide
Mhm.
that service. And the way in which it may roll out in our institutions, I see, and of course I'm biased based on my experiences, but I had taught a course for many years on the internet and American life, and it became very popular. So there were 6 sessions a semester. And the instructors would deliver the class, but I'd serve as the master instructor. So if there was a problem, a difficult question, it would come to me. And I foresee that our academic institutions may do the same with a cadre of bots, if you will, or with one large bot dealing with groupings of 30 students taking a given class. So there still will be a personal engagement, a human engagement, I guess I should say. But I think that this is an important advent, and certainly we are not a year away from that. Preparing our administrations, preparing our departments, preparing our faculty for understanding the reality of what's coming is up to many of those in our audience today. We have a responsibility in this area, and those in professional and continuing education certainly have a role. We're leading higher ed. We're becoming much more a central part of higher education. And I think that we need to provide leadership to our institutions in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, as one of the participants wrote, I mean, there's more than just GPT out there. There's Google Bard. There is the release of GPT-5 next year. Gemini, Google's Gemini is coming out as well. So there is a whole revolutionary thing. I think the focus here is that this is kind of the first. Well, I shouldn't say the first. It's probably the most highlighted tool. And at the moment, I think based on the advancements that have happened over the last couple of months and the last 4 days, I would say that there is some clear advantages for OpenAI at the moment, but things could change in a matter of weeks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me read just briefly a paragraph, or not even that, from one of my most recent articles. And I note that in all of my research, when I use Gen AI, I use at least 3 established apps. Claude 2, Bard, as you say, ChatGPT, Perplexity. There are just so many of them out there that are quality, but assuring that they're using different, um, a different large language model. So they're using a different model to come up with their answers. Because right now we still have some problems. Glitches do occur. So it's not just you and I, Rod, typing in the wrong word, a little
Mhm.
slip typo, but it's also these two. So by doing three, you can compare and contrast, and it helps you from being led astray. I think the success to using these technologies, the first key to success is crafting quality prompts, and we should practice it every day. Put a prompt in across 3 different apps and see what you get. The second one is to use more than one Gen AI app. And finally, the third key is that, once again, to do it daily. Through that repetition, we will get better at writing prompts, and we'll know over time what elicits additional valuable information. So those are just a couple pieces that seem relevant.
Thanks, Ray. So as we're heading towards the top of the hour, I do have one rather big question I want to ask you. And this is a quote, and I'm going to read the quote, right? It's a quote by Chomsky that was published March 8th in the New York Times 2023, and it goes like this. Whereas humans are limited in the kinds of explanations we can rationally conjure, machine learning systems can learn both that the earth is flat and that the earth is round. They trade merely in probabilities that change over time. For this reason, the predictions of machine learning systems will always be superficial and dubious. In short, ChatGPT and its brethren are constitutionally unable to balance creativity with constraint. They either over-generate content or under-generate. Given the amorality, faux science, and linguistic incompetence of these systems, we can only laugh and cry at their popularity. Any comments on that?
Sure. Yeah, I have high respect for Noam Chomsky in semiotics and language studies. I think, he's been an important leader over the decades. But in this area, I think he's naive. You know, it it harkens in my mind where we were in 1909 when the Model T just came out, or when was it, 1976 when the IBM XT came out, and making judgments of what a minimal computer using, what was it, 600 kilobytes? I don't know. But it was a very tiny system and what it could do. And now, of course, so much more can be done. This is a field that's going to continue to expand. And I see, in fact, I'll be talking about down at Georgia Tech next month about quantum computing merging or becoming the driver, if you will, of generative AI, where we can handle massive, much larger amounts of information and get responses, you know, uh, so much faster. So I think that this is a short-sighted. I think it may be accurate for when he wrote that in March of 2023, but let's revisit this in 2028 and 2030, and it'll be even in 2024, it'll be a far different environment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in all due fairness, I think if you were to listen or read the entire article and listen to his interviews, I mean, he does raise some fairly cogent, criticisms and things that as we proceed to the implementation of these technologies, something that we should, consider. Last question, and this one's an easy one, Ray. Any aha moments for you in the course of your career, including what we're talking about today?
Every day I have an aha moment, but I'll take one from yesterday. Yesterday, I asked Bard because of a response I had gotten from one, and I said, "What further do you provide out of your LLM than I can get in Google search?" And it went on and on and on about unpublished and published text, which is not available online, about department reports at universities that end up part of an obscure submission to the Board of Regents that just generally don't see the light of day. There is so much that these tools have access to, so far beyond what we're used to. And I might end with this. I think too many people who use this tool use that kind of first level that you described. What is a black hole? They use this tool as Google, as a Google search, rather than really as an assistant, as being able to provide so much more to us. So I think that's part of our job too, is to help our faculty, staff, administrators understand the immensity of these models and the potential that they can provide to us.
Well, thanks. This has been a really interesting discussion. And I think, again, the idea of using multiple tools is an important one. One tool I should mention, by the way, Google Bard, is still not available in this country, in Canada. But there are others that are. So I think this has been, highly informative. Very much enjoyed your insights, Ray. I'm going to turn things over to Karen for some closing remarks.
Great. Thanks, Rod and Ray, for the great discussion today. And on behalf of the Division of Extended Education at the University of Manitoba, I'd really like to thank all of our webinar participants for joining us today. Just a note, you will receive a brief survey immediately following today's session to gather any comments or feedback you'd like to share with us. And you'll also receive a follow-up email next week with a link to the webpage where you'll find the recording of today's webinar along with the slides that we're showing. This is our second webinar in our Lifelong Learning webinar series, and we'll be resuming early in the new year and have some very exciting speakers lined up. So we look forward to sharing those details in the coming weeks. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Oh,
Karen, if I could say one last thing.
Absolutely.
So again, thank you, Ray. And Ray will be joining us again in May of 2020. I was going to say 2023, 2024. As we have a panel discussion with a lot of our panelists that have joined us throughout the year. And I'm sure, Ray, this conversation may seem dated by May of 2024. So we'll see where things are at by then.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good day.
Thank you.